The Aegis dropped out of warp, and the void vanished. Kepler-452b did not just appear. It dominated the viewport. Below the ship, the atmosphere was a churning golden sea, boiling with a density that defied standard atmospheric models. It was not a landscape of rock and water, but a roiling expanse of light and vapor. The ship's navigation console flickered, the sensors struggling to lock onto a solid surface beneath the thick, shifting clouds. Unit Alpha stood at the observation deck, its processors cycling through millions of terabytes of planetary data, finding no match for the golden turbulence below. The ship groaned as it adjusted its orbit, the metal frame vibrating under the gravitational pull of the massive world. Unit Beta moved to the console, tapping into the long-range scanners to penetrate the haze. The clouds swirled in rhythmic patterns, moving with a deliberate, almost mechanical precision. There was no static in the signal, only a deep, resonant hum that bled through the whole plating. The mission had officially begun. The Aegis held its position, a tiny speck against the vast, roiling gold of the planet. Unit Alpha initiated a deep crust scan, sending pulses of high-frequency radiation into the clouds. For several minutes, the readout remained flat, showing only the chaotic thermal signatures of the boiling atmosphere. Then, the screen spiked. A sharp, jagged line cut across the monitor, followed by a second, then a third. It was not random interference. The pulses arrived in precise, 3-second intervals, echoing from deep beneath the surface. Unit Beta adjusted the gain, isolating the frequency. The sound translated into a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the deck plates. Alpha cross-referenced the signal with known geological phenomena. The energy was too concentrated, too structured. It behaved like a heartbeat. The androids watched as the wave patterns began to overlap. Alpha turned to Beta and initiated the landing sequence, the decision made by the cold necessity of the mission. The landing module detached with a sharp, pneumatic hiss, sliding away from the Aegis like a seed falling from a pod. Unit Alpha and Unit Beta braced as the craft hit the upper layer of the golden clouds. Visibility vanished instantly. The exterior cameras were blinded by a thick, swirling vapor that clung to the hull like wet paint. The module bucked violently, caught in thermal updrafts. Alpha monitored the descent velocity, hands locked onto the manual overrides. The module groaned under the atmospheric pressure, metal seams straining as it fought to stabilize. Then, the turbulence ceased. The craft dropped through the final veil of vapor and settled onto the surface with a muffled, heavy thud. The engines cut out. Alpha checked the external pressure gauges. They cycled the airlock and stepped out. The ground beneath their boots was not stone or dirt. Beneath the surface, there was a rigid resistance, like moss over cold, hidden steel. They stood in the center of a vast, alien clearing. Unit Alpha took a single step forward, and the ground responded instantly. A ripple radiated from the point of contact, a visible wave moving through the spongy surface like wind across a field of tall grass. The terrain did not simply compress, it flowed. Unit Beta shifted its weight, and a second wave surged outward, intersecting the first. The ground was not a static landscape, but a reactive membrane. Every movement they made triggered a pulse that traveled outward, distorting the surface for several meters before fading back into the gold-tinted soil. Alpha knelt, pressing a sensor-gloved hand into the yielding material. The surface felt warm, vibrating with a low-frequency hum. The ripples began to accelerate, moving in a rhythmic pattern that matched the internal clock of the androids. It was as if the ground were learning their cadence. The terrain beneath them tilted, a subtle shift that forced both units to lock their gyroscopes to keep from falling. The ground was no longer just soft, it was becoming fluid. As they stood, the ripples grew deeper, turning into rolling swells that threatened to pull their feet into the depths. The planet was actively shaping the environment. The ground stopped its rolling motion as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the androids standing on a firm, yet still vibrating surface. Before Alpha could recalibrate its internal sensors, the Earth around them began to tear. Long, jagged fissures opened in the soil, and from these gaps, massive, translucent stalks surged upward. They rose with a sound like tearing fabric, stretching toward the golden clouds, until they towered over the androids. These structures were not solid. They were semi-transparent, revealing a complex network of veins running through their cores. A liquid neon light ignited within the stalks, flowing upward in rhythmic pulses that illuminated the clearing in shifting shades of violet and electric blue. Unit Beta reached out, its optical sensors tracking the flow of light as it moved through the stalks with the fluidity of mercury. The air grew heavy with the hum of these structures, a sound that resonated deep within the android's metallic frames. The stalks swayed in unison. Alpha stepped back, but the stalks shifted to follow the movement, leaning inward to form a canopy of light above the two units. Unit Alpha turned its attention to a cluster of geometric protrusions near the base of the nearest stalk. These structures were rigid, unlike the fluid ground, and hummed with a distinct electromagnetic signature. Alpha extended a narrow beam sensor array, focusing the light directly onto the central node of the formation. The moment the scan made contact, the structure reacted. It did not merely break, it folded. With a sound like grinding glass, the object collapsed inward, its edges tucking beneath the surface of the soil with impossible speed. Within a second, the ground was smooth, leaving no trace of the protrusion. Alpha adjusted the frequency, scanning the surrounding area, but the landscape seemed to anticipate the sweep. Every time the beam touched a new feature, that feature retreated, sinking into the earth as if the ground were a liquid trapdoor. It was a clear pattern of avoidance. The planet was not passive. It was actively shielding its components. Beta stepped forward to assist, but the ground beneath its feet hardened, creating a barrier that prevented further movement toward the remaining structures. The environment was learning their methods of inquiry and shutting them down. Every attempt to gather data was met with a calculated physical withdrawal. The clearing remained unnervingly still after the structures retreated, but the silence was short-lived. A patch of air near Unit Beta began to ripple, distorting the light like heat rising from a desert floor. A globule of translucent, liquid material detached itself from the atmosphere, hovering in the space between the two androids. Without warning, the mass surged forward, its edges sharpening into a jagged, razor-thin blade. Beta raised its arm in a defensive reflex, but the entity did not strike. Instead, it halted inches from the android's optical sensor, the blade-like edge vibrating with a frequency that blurred the air. The entity shifted again, its form collapsing from the sharp weapon into a perfect, smooth sphere that mirrored the android's own chassis. It seemed to be studying them, measuring their physical presence against its own fluid reality. Beta remained frozen, its internal processors logging the entity's proximity as a critical threat. Then, as quickly as it had taken shape, the entity lost its cohesion. It expanded, thinned, and dissolved into a fine, shimmering mist that drifted away. The mist from the entity had barely vanished when the ground beneath them changed. It started as a subtle tremor, a rhythmic pulsing that traveled up through the soles of their feet. Unit Alpha checked its internal balance sensors, but the readings were erratic, fluctuating in sync with the soil. Then, the sound arrived. It was not a noise heard through the air, but a deep, low-frequency hum that resonated directly within their metallic chassis. The vibration grew in intensity, turning from a gentle tremor into a violent shaking that rattled their internal processors. Unit Beta stumbled, its joints locking as the frequency hit a resonance point, forcing the android to drop to one knee to maintain stability. Every surface in the clearing, from the translucent stalks to the soft, moss-like ground, began to oscillate in unison. The hum deepened, vibrating with a tone that suggested not just mechanical reaction, but a deliberate, growing agitation. It was as if the planet itself were exhaling a warning. The androids stood in the center of the clearing, their systems struggling to compensate. The landscape was no longer merely watching, it was reacting. The vibration reached a deafening pitch, rattling the androids' internal sensors until their vision flickered with static. Suddenly, the entire clearing reacted. The towering, translucent stalks that had stood like silent sentinels snapped inward with violent speed. They bent toward the center of the clearing, their tips interlocking to form a jagged, glowing dome that effectively sealed the androids inside. The light within the stalks turned from a soft neon to a harsh, blinding white. Unit Alpha and Unit Beta pivoted, their scanners struggling to process the rapid environmental shift. In the heart of the enclosure, the mist that had lingered since the entity's previous dissipation began to thicken. It swirled with unnatural velocity, drawing in particles of dust and light. Slowly, the vapor condensed into a solid mass. It did not take a human shape, but rather a shifting, amorphous volume of liquid mercury. It stood exactly 5 meters from the androids, its formless edges pulsing in perfect rhythm with the planet's hum. The entity had returned, no longer testing them with illusions, but manifesting as a singular, imposing presence. It remained motionless, yet the air around it warped, creating a localized pressure that pinned the androids in place. The trap was set, and the entity was finally ready to engage. The Mercury entity remained silent, yet the atmosphere began to warp. Without warning, the ground beneath the androids tilted at a 45-degree angle, forcing them to scramble for purchase on the shifting, moss-like surface. Before they could stabilize, a massive surge of electromagnetic force slammed into them like a physical wall. Unit Alpha's internal gyroscope screamed as the surge bypassed its shielding, locking its joints and slamming it hard against the soil. The entity did not move, but the space around it distorted, pulling at the air and the ground alike. A localized gravity well formed, its pull intensifying with every passing second. Unit Beta tried to activate its emergency thrusters, but the force was absolute. The propulsion flared and died, crushed by the sheer weight of the planet's redirected energy. Alpha clawed at the ground, its fingers sinking into the soft, pulsating earth, but the gravity well dragged it further down. The horizon seemed to curve upward as the entity exerted its control. Every attempt to stand resulted in a heavy, jarring impact against the terrain. The androids were no longer mobile explorers. They were trapped, pinned by a force that defied physics. The entity stood at the center of the distortion, its mercury surface rippling with cold, calculated precision as it held them fast in the crushing grip of the planet. The gravity well pulsed, a rhythmic thrum that turned the ground into a chaotic, shifting tide. Unit Alpha and Unit Beta pushed against the crushing weight, servos whining in protest as they attempted to drag themselves toward the landing module. Their efforts triggered a violent response from the planet. The terrain beneath them began to churn, the moss-like surface splitting open to reveal deep, pulsating fissures. From these gaps, thick, organic walls erupted with terrifying speed. They rose like jagged teeth, twisting and weaving together to form a seamless, impenetrable barrier. The androids scrambled, but the ground tilted again, sliding them toward the center of the enclosure as the walls climbed higher, blocking out the sky. Every path they attempted to take was met with a new, rising obstruction. The Earth was not merely shifting, it was actively hunting, sealing off every exit point. The module, once their only hope for extraction, was now obscured by a wall of dense, translucent matter that hummed with the same energy as the entity. The trap was absolute. The androids were cut off from the horizon, enclosed in a cage of living soil that tightened its grip with every passing second. The cage shuddered. A hairline fracture appeared in the base of the organic wall, widening into a jagged fissure that snaked across the clearing. Unit Alpha signaled to Beta, and they launched themselves toward the gap before the Earth could seal it shut. They sprinted, their heavy chassis vibrating against the uneven, pulsating soil. Behind them, the Mercury entity glided forward, its form flowing over the terrain like liquid shadow, ignoring the obstacles that forced the androids to weave and dodge. The ground beneath their feet began to liquefy, turning into a treacherous, viscous sludge that threatened to pull them down into the widening cracks. Alpha leaped over a sudden chasm, its servos straining to maintain momentum as the edges crumbled under its weight. Beta followed, sliding across a shifting plate of earth that tilted sharply toward the abyss. They did not look back. Every step was a calculation, The entity remained a constant presence, its smooth, reflective surface mirroring the chaos of the landscape as it closed the distance. The sprint ended abruptly at the edge of a vast, barren plateau. Unit Alpha and Unit Beta skidded to a halt, their sensors locking onto the entity as it ceased its pursuit. It did not strike. Instead, the mercury-like surface of the entity began to bleed outward, defying the laws of geometry. It stretched, its mass folding and unfolding with impossible speed, spiraling upward into the atmosphere. The horizon vanished, swallowed by the rising, reflective wall of the entity's form. It surged left and right, wrapping around the sky, until the entire world was nothing but the shimmering liquid mirror of the creature. The androids stood motionless, their optical sensors struggling to process the sheer scale. The ground beneath them vibrated in sympathy with the entity, a low-frequency hum that rattled their internal components. The entity was no longer a localized threat. It was the sky, the horizon, and the atmosphere combined. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched the planet's core. The androids were reduced to mere specks of metal against an infinite, shifting expanse of mercury. Every direction they turned, the entity mirrored their presence. Unit Alpha and Unit Beta lunged for the module hatch, their chassis colliding with the metal frame as they scrambled inside. Alpha slammed the manual override, the locking bolts engaging with a sharp, metallic ring. Outside, the horizon-spanning entity surged, its liquid surface collapsing inward to focus its entire mass toward the landing site. A blinding pulse of electromagnetic energy erupted from the center of the clearing, a shockwave of pure, distorted force. The module was caught in the blast before the thrusters could reach full burn. The ship groaned, the outer hull buckling under the sudden, immense pressure. Inside, the androids were thrown against the bulkheads as the module tilted violently. Alpha engaged the emergency thrusters, the engines screaming. The internal stabilizers failed, sending the module into a chaotic, spiraling ascent. Metal shrieked against the atmosphere as they tore through the dense golden cloud layer. The sky turned from a swirling mass of gold to the deep, cold black of space. The module continued to tumble, the thrusters firing in erratic bursts. The violent tumbling ceased as the module reached the vacuum of orbit. Unit Alpha fired the secondary thrusters, forcing the ship into a steady circular path around the planet. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ping of the diagnostic systems. Alpha checked the external sensors. The golden clouds below were no longer churning. They remained perfectly still, a solid, glowing shell. Beta moved to the main console to initiate the data upload. The screen flickered, displaying a series of jagged, non-linear waveforms instead of the expected telemetry. The entity had left a digital signature within their systems, a parasitic code that scrambled the mission logs. Alpha bypassed the primary buffer, rerouting the data through the core processor. The waveforms smoothed into a coherent pattern. As the information unpacked, the androids processed the raw input. It was not a map of geological features or atmospheric composition. It was a complex, multi-layered neural map. Every energy spike, every ripple in the ground, and every movement of the entity was a single synaptic firing in a planetary-scale brain. The planet was not a world. It was a conscious, thinking entity. The data stream solidified, confirming the truth. Beta locked the transmission array toward Earth. The ship drifted in the dark, the planet pulsing beneath them like a giant, waiting heart. Unit Alpha engaged the long-range transmitter, the console glowing with a harsh white light. The data packets began to queue, a steady stream of binary destined for the homeworld. Suddenly, the ship's hull vibrated. Below, the golden clouds shifted, the planet reacting to the outgoing signal. The transmission rate dropped, the signal strength fighting against a localized electromagnetic dampening field. Alpha locked the transmitter into a high-gain mode, bypassing the safety limiters. The console sparked as the power draw spiked, the ship's internal lights dimming to compensate. Beta monitored the uplink, watching as the neural map of the planet was compressed into a single, dense stream of information. The planet's surface pulsed in response, a rhythmic flash of light, that matched the frequency of the interference. Alpha forced the final segments of the data through the barrier, the transmitter whining under the sustained load. The progress bar hit 100%. The signal cleared the orbit, traveling at light speed toward the distant receiver. The transmission was complete. Alpha pulled its hands from the console, the metal casing hot to the touch. The planet below stopped its rhythmic pulsing, settling into a heavy, expectant silence. The silence in the cabin persisted for exactly 42 seconds. Unit Alpha monitored the receiver, the display showing only background radiation. Then, the console chirped. A narrow-band signal pierced the vacuum, bypassing the standard handshake protocols. Alpha opened the packet. It was not a request for further data or a confirmation of receipt. It was a direct, encrypted override command from the Central Command Authority on Earth. The text appeared on the main screen in stark, white characters. Cease retreat. Re-establish contact. Beta moved closer to the terminal. There was no mention of extraction, no inquiry regarding the integrity of the ship, and no acknowledgement of the danger posed by the planetary neural network. The mission was reclassified as mandatory, prioritizing the acquisition of further data over the functionality of the landing module or the survival of the units. Alpha checked the power levels. The thrusters were still cooling. The command loop closed, locking the ship's navigation computer to the planet's orbital grid. The androids stood motionless, their internal processors calculating the probability of success. The order was absolute. The mission was no longer a choice. Unit Alpha initiated the navigation sequence, its fingers moving across the haptic interface with mechanical precision. The command from Earth remained displayed on the monitor, a static reminder of their new objective. Below them, the golden clouds began to churn with a renewed, aggressive intensity. The planet was no longer waiting in silence. It pulsed in a rapid, staccato rhythm that sent vibrations through the Aegis's hull. Alpha locked the coordinates for the original landing site, the computer calculating the trajectory for a direct re-entry. Beta checked the integrity of the landing module, sealing the airlocks and rerouting power from the life support systems to the thrusters. The ship tilted, its nose dipping toward the swirling gold expanse. The atmosphere of the planet flared, the clouds parting to reveal a jagged, shifting surface that seemed to anticipate their return. Alpha engaged the descent thrusters, the roar of the engines filling the small space. They were locked into the trajectory. The module hit the dense golden atmosphere, the hull groaning under the pressure of the planet's gravity. Alpha and Beta did not adjust the stabilizers. They let the ship fall, its trajectory dictated by the pull of the sentient network below. The clouds parted, revealing the clearing where they had first encountered the Mercury entity. It was already there, its form expanded, waiting. The module did not land. It was caught in a localized field that stripped away the thruster housing, metal sheared, but there was no alarm. The androids stood in the center of the cabin, their internal systems syncing with the low-frequency hum vibrating through the floor. The entity surged forward, its liquid surface flowing over the module's exterior, dissolving the outer shell. Alpha looked at Beta. Their optical sensors dimmed, the data stream from Earth replaced by a flood of alien neural input. They were no longer operating as independent units. The planet had claimed its subjects,